You know, it's funny when you really think about it. We're surrounded by water. Like, I mean, just look out the window, open up the news website, whatever, you see it everywhere. But after this deep dive into the global water crisis and all the research you sent over, articles, research papers, even personal accounts, wow. Let's just say, after all that, that word surrounded, it's got a whole new meaning to me now. The sheer amount of information here is a lot to unpack, that's for sure. But one of the first things that really jumped out at me, it's this whole idea that even though our planet is literally covered in water, the stuff we can actually use, it's way, way less than you'd think. Shockingly scarce, actually.
Yeah, you're right. It is a striking contrast, and you've put your finger on something really crucial right off the bat there.
Yeah.
We really do take clean, accessible water for granted. It's
Yeah.
just always there, right? But the reality is, it's a lot more fragile than we realize. You mentioned the Earth being covered in water, and it's true. There's a mind-boggling amount, something like 326 million trillion gallons. But that picture we always see, that blue marble from space, it's kind of misleading because out of all that water, only a tiny fraction, like around 1%, is actually the kind of fresh water that we can use directly.
Wow, 1%. That's it. That really puts it into perspective. It's like we see all this water, but it's almost like looking at a giant plate of food when you can only have a tiny bite, you know? And speaking of scarcity, this actually ties into something I found pretty alarming in the research. Did you know that more people are directly affected by drought than any other natural disaster?
It is a startling statistic, and it highlights a critical concept that came up throughout pretty much everything you sent over: water stress.
Hmm.
Because you see, it's not just about how much total water exists on the planet. It's about this complex web of supply and demand, and maybe even more importantly, access. Our global population keeps growing. Industries need more and more water for all sorts of things. And then there's agriculture. In fact, did you know that agriculture uses a whopping 70% of the world's fresh water?
70%. Seriously, I knew it was a lot, especially with all the stuff I've been reading about sustainable farming and all that. But wow, 70% is huge. So it sounds like we're talking about this kind of, I don't know, perfect storm situation, right? More people, more demand. And then on top of all of that, you've got climate change looming over everything.
Exactly. Climate change is like, it's throwing a wrench into the whole system. The global water cycle, that natural process of evaporation, rain, water flowing and all that,
Yeah.
it's being seriously disrupted, speeding up in ways that are throwing everything off balance. And one of the biggest red flags, the glaciers and snowpack, those massive reserves of frozen water that billions of people rely on, they're shrinking, and they're shrinking fast.
Yeah, that's something I saw mentioned over and over in the research you sent, the shrinking glaciers. But it really hit home when I got to those firsthand accounts. It's one thing to hear about melting glaciers in the abstract, but it's another thing entirely to read about what it's like for communities who depend on that water, watching it disappear year after year.
Absolutely. And that's where the human cost of all of this really hits home. It goes from being this big abstract problem to something real and immediate. It highlights just how interconnected these systems really are.
Hmm.
Something changes way over there with melting glaciers, and it can ripple out and have a huge impact on, well, everything.
Hmm.
Food security, political stability, you name it. It's all connected in this incredibly complex web.
Well, it can feel a little overwhelming, can it, when you start to really dig into these massive global problems like the water crisis? It's easy to get to that place where you think, what can I even do? But one thing that really struck me when I was going through all the stuff you sent, it's not a hopeless situation. We're not just, totally powerless here.
Not at all. And a lot of the pieces you shared actually highlighted how much of a difference individual actions can make. Like there was that one person who talked about how they cut their water use at home like crazy, and it was all just from making simple changes. Shorter showers, actually fixing that leaky faucet instead of putting it off, using less water in the garden, stuff like that.
See, now that's what I need to hear. Those are the kinds of things that actually feel doable. It reminded me of that company Lumala. They were in one of those articles. They make this, I don't know, it's almost like a smart irrigation system for vineyards. Totally solar powered. You control it with an app on your phone. And get this, it's helping these winemakers use something like 30% less water. That's incredible.
30%, that's right. It's a perfect example of how technology can be used to make a real difference. Lumos system, it uses sensors to check the soil moisture, even the weather conditions, and it's all happening in real time. So it basically gives each vine exactly the right amount of water, no more wasted water, just, evaporating off or soaking into the ground where it's not doing any good. And speaking of high-tech solutions for agriculture, did you see that stuff about iron ox? They're growing food in these high-tech greenhouses, but the whole thing is run by robots. And the really cool part, they use a tiny fraction of the water, that you'd need for traditional farming.
Iron ox, yeah. I was blown away by that. It's like, imagine if we could grow all of our produce locally all year round and use a fraction of the water. That would be a total game changer.
It's definitely exciting to think about.
Yeah.
And it begs the question, what's the holdup? Why aren't we seeing these kinds of things everywhere? But as with a lot of things, it's complicated. Sometimes it's the cost, sometimes the infrastructure isn't there to support it, and let's be honest, sometimes it's just plain old resistance to trying new things. But even beyond technology, there are some big conversations happening right now about rethinking how we approach water rights, like literally treating water as a commodity, something that could be bought and sold.
Oh, yeah, the whole water market thing. That definitely got some strong reactions in the articles you sent. I'll say that much. It's one thing to talk about conserving water, but putting a price tag on it, that's a whole other can of worms.
It's definitely a controversial idea, and it's understandable why people would have mixed feelings about it. I mean, we're talking about putting a literal price on something that is essential for life. There are huge concerns about fairness and who gets left behind. But on the other side, there are some who argue that if you put a value on water, it forces people to be more mindful, more responsible about how they use it. It's no longer something you can just take for granted. Like that research you sent about farmers in California selling their water rights to cities, that's a real-world example of this playing out right now.
It's kind of wild when you think about it, you know? This farmer who might have had water rights for generations, all of a sudden they're in this position where they can sell some of that water to help a city that's struggling with drought. It's like we're in uncharted territory here. Hey, speaking of uncharted territory, can we talk about the iceberg idea for a second? I have to hear your take on this. You know that whole thing about towing icebergs from Antarctica to use as a freshwater source?
Oh yeah, that's definitely been kicking around for a while. I mean, logistically, it's insane, right? But it does make you think. And the funny thing is, this isn't just some crazy idea that someone came up with after too much coffee. They were actually having serious discussions about this back in the 70s. There was a whole conference about it.
I know, right? It sounds crazy, but then you think about it and it's like, well, I guess desperate times call for desperate measures. But I will say, I was relieved to see that there were some slightly more realistic solutions in the mix, too. Like that whole fog harvesting thing that's happening over in Morocco. It's like something out of a sci-fi book.
Right. It sounds like it should be in Dune or something. But it's real, and it's actually working. They put up these giant nets in areas where there's a lot of fog, and those nets trap the tiny water droplets in the air. And it adds up. They collect the water, and it can be a real lifeline for communities, especially in dry coastal areas. It's amazing, really.
That's incredible. It really shows how creative people can be when they're faced with a challenge. But it also makes you wonder, why aren't we seeing more of that kind of ingenuity? Why aren't we seeing more investment in these long-term solutions?
You're asking the right questions. It's like we're so quick to jump on the flashy high-tech solutions, which, don't get me wrong, those are important. But sometimes the most effective solutions are staring us right in the face, and they're not very glamorous. Case in point, and get ready for it, leaky pipes.
Okay, yeah, that's not exactly going to win any innovation awards, is it? Fixing leaky pipes.
Nope, not very exciting. But here's the thing, and I bet you saw this in the research too. We lose billions with a B, of gallons of perfectly good treated water every single year because of aging pipes and infrastructure that just hasn't kept up. It's like this silent crisis that most people don't even realize is happening.
It's so true. We're always focused on the big, dramatic solutions, but sometimes it really is about getting those basics right. But even when we have the solutions, the technology, the know-how, there's still this human element to the water crisis that we just can't ignore. And that came through loud and clear in some of those personal accounts that you sent me, especially the ones from Karachi. It really makes you think. We can talk about water scarcity in terms of like charts and graphs and all those big global trends, but those stories that we were just talking about, especially the ones from Karachi, they really personalize the whole thing. It's easy to forget that there are real people whose lives are being turned upside down by this. It's really disheartening to think about people literally struggling to get access to something as basic as clean, safe water.
It's tragic, and it highlights this uncomfortable truth about resources. Any resource, really. When something becomes scarce, it creates opportunities for exploitation. And the stories coming out of Karachi are a perfect example of that, unfortunately. These water mafias that control access to those illegal hydrants, they're profiting off of desperation, basically. They know people need water, So they charge outrageous prices, and what are people going to do?
It's awful. And it's not even just about being able to afford the water. It's the safety aspect, too. We were reading about how those illegal hydrants often get destroyed by the authorities. So not only are people put in this vulnerable position in the first place, but then they risk losing what little access they have, and for what?
It's a no-win situation for so many people, and it just shines a light on how crucial it is to have proper infrastructure in place. And that actually made me think about something else we were discussing earlier, the Flint water crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about a situation where the system completely failed the people it was supposed to be serving.
It's a scary parallel, isn't it? Two completely different contexts, but both highlighting how devastating it is when we neglect those basic needs. When access to clean water is treated as an afterthought, it has real consequences.
Absolutely. What happened in Flint, the lead contamination, the long-term health problems people are still dealing with, it should serve as a wake-up call, really. It shows how fragile trust is, and once it's broken, especially when it comes to something as essential as water, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild. People need to know that they can trust the water coming out of their taps.
It really underscores how important it is to get this right. These aren't just abstract concepts we're talking about. They affect real people's lives in really profound ways. But, okay, I need a little bit of hope here. Because it's easy to go down the rabbit hole of doom and gloom with this stuff. What about those solar-powered water projects in Pakistan? No, those felt hopeful.
Right. Talk about ingenuity. It's amazing what they're doing. These solar-powered systems that are filtering and dispensing clean water, often to entire communities, and they're doing it all using renewable energy. And the impact is incredible. I think I read that a single one of those solar-powered units can provide clean water for thousands of people.
That's amazing. It kind of blows my mind, really. Knowing how much good can be done with a little bit of innovation and some creative problem solving, but it does make you wonder, what's the secret sauce here? How do we bottle this and get it out to the rest of the world? Because it seems like if they can do it there, we should be able to figure this out everywhere.
You hit the nail on the head.
Mm.
What does it take to scale these solutions? Is it a matter of political will, funding, or do we need a fundamental shift in how we think about water as a society? Because that's the heart of it, isn't it?
It is. And it's interesting you say that because that's the debate that kept coming up over and over again in everything that we've been looking at. Is water a commodity that should be bought and sold? Is it a basic human right that everyone should have equal access to? There are so many different perspectives on this.
And there are no easy answers. It's a complex issue, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We have to consider so many factors: social equity, environmental impact, economics. It's a balancing act, for sure.
And I guess that's why the example of Singapore is so fascinating, right? They're like the ultimate case study in what's possible. They have practically no natural freshwater sources to speak of, and yet they've managed to become a global leader in water sustainability. It's mind-boggling, really.
It is, and it really underscores the power of long-term vision, smart investments, and a commitment to doing things differently. They've gone all in on things like desalination plants, rainwater harvesting on a massive scale, and investing in cutting-edge water treatment technologies. They basically said, okay, we have this challenge. What are we going to do about it? And they just went for it.
It's inspiring, and it brings us back to that core question, doesn't it? As we move forward, what path are we going to choose? Are we going to keep doing things the way we've always done them, hoping for the best? Or are we going to take a page from Singapore's book and really embrace new ways of thinking, new technologies, and new ways of managing this precious resource?
Because one thing is for sure, the future of water, it's really up to us to decide.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we're going to have to leave it there for today. This has been an incredible deep dive, and I hope everyone listening out there is walking away with as much food for thought as I am. Until next time.